Hello and welcome to our English webinar. Today it's my great pleasure to introduce Chris Curtis, who's going to be leading this afternoon's session on helping every student become a confident reader. Chris probably needs no introduction to most of you. He is an experienced head of English and the author of How to Teach English, The Art of Writing English Literature Essays, his blog, Learning from My Mistakes, and of course, Develop Brilliant Reading, the teacher pack he published with Collins earlier this year. Chris's presentation will take around 50 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions to take us to 5 p.m. So if you have any questions, please do drop them in the chat at any point, and Chris will answer them at the end. Just to let you know that this webinar is being recorded, and you'll be sent a link to the recording after the webinar. Also, anyone who's here today will be entered into a prize draw to win a copy of Chris's resource. I'll now hand over to Chris, and I hope you all enjoy what promises to be a wonderful session.
Thank you for that. Okay, just to give you a set of context, I'm actually in my classroom at the moment, so there's a kind of bit of practicalities about it at the moment. So I've got the cleaners working away at the moment, so apologies if you hear any noise. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through a bit of a journey with our reading journey in our school. And I'm going to talk to you about the problems that we had with measuring reading and the issues we've had around reading and how we've kind of used a bit of current research in there to build our curriculum and to support our curriculum. And I'm going to kind of highlight some of the problems that I think as English teachers and heads of English and anybody dealing with literacy of what we've got to be thinking about. And also we're going to spend some time looking at some examples of what students have produced and looking at how we could possibly respond to the kind of things that students produce themselves. Now, before I start, I will say that there is a prize draw, and anybody that attends today will be entered into the prize draw to receive the book itself. Okay, so just going to go through and just talk to you about the assessment problem that we used to have. Now, we have used, like most schools, we've used reading ages and reading tests and standardized tests to gauge reading for a long time. So we used to do it basically at the start of year 7 and the end of year 9, and to see what was the impact that Key Stage 3 curriculum was having and seeing how students were progressing in terms of things. On top of that, from an English point of view, we had a number of assessments that we did, and a lot of our reading assessments were based on essays. Now, before I start and go into a bit more detail, I want to talk about the problem that we had with reading tests. Now, there are a number of different tests, and I think reading tests have their usage in terms of, standardized stuff. There's a number of companies that produce it, and this isn't about me criticizing them. They are useful to a certain point, but I don't think they help us as practitioners to understand what's actually going on in the reading process. They flag some things up for us and they give us a little bit of information. But if we start with the whole idea, most of them produce a reading age for us. Now, I just want you to just have a little bit of a think, a reading age of 13, what does that tell us? So I'm just going to give you a minute just to have a little bit of a think about what does that actually tell us? I'm hoping that for most people, you'll agree that it doesn't really tell us that much. And the problem is when schools are using massive systems that are judging reading ages and we're throwing these numbers out, it doesn't really help a practitioner understand what students can do and what they cannot do. Because what does a reading age do? It kind of categorizes them to a bit, but it just really says where they are in relation to their peers and where they should be. So for years we used the reading age and we put them on all our mark books, and it didn't really help teachers because all it showed them was somebody that was weak, but it didn't identify what the weaknesses were. And so we've kind of moved away from using reading ages, because if you think about it, we're kind of in an age at the moment now, when we go for getting our cars fixed and go for an MOT, is often we don't have anything to do with that process. And a lot of it is digitized and it's using computer systems. And so often what happens is we go in, they produce a report, and we don't know what that report means. We don't know what needs fixing, and we need somebody to translate it. Now, often reading age tests generate this kind of information. They give us general information, but they don't give us specific information about precisely what students need to do to get better. And so it becomes a little bit problematic. So we've used those for a number of years now, and we kind of felt, well, you know, yes, we can see progress. We've got reading age tests there. We can see that according to this system that they are improving, but it wasn't really helping us in terms of the teaching and how to develop the reading and to identify it. So what we did is we categorized different readers. And so what we're able to do with using the reading age test is we kind of categorize students into 4 different categories. So we had the emerging. So those are the students that we know are kind of, they're struggling with decoding, breaking down. They've got a real issue with word knowledge, okay? Then we categorized the group up, which we said primarily these students, their issues tend to be inference. So they can break down words, but what they're not doing is developing an inference and looking at the subtext. And then as we go further on, we're kind of looking at, so fluency, so the good students in terms of reading, what they need to work on generally is precision and nuance. And then categorizing right at the top, we've got groups of students who need depth and challenge. Now, that is a very, very loose approach to it, and it's not an exact approach to it. But if you're thinking somebody that's teaching geography, teaching science, it gives them an idea of how to approach reading, because it's not just talking about English teachers, we're also talking about other teachers and how to approach reading and what to do with the reading. So we're kind of giving teachers the meta language to understand, if I've got this specific student in here, this is what I've got to do. And so we kind of use the reading age test to kind of build that data for us. And then we can kind of refine it a little bit more detail. And we can, within the English department, we can identify if there is an issue with a particular kind of student that is inference, or if there's a particular issue with kind of decoding, we can change that. So on our mark books, across all the school, I'm just going to go back to one in a second, is we've got this kind of data. So every mark book we've got, so really the teacher, when they look at their group, and this is not just English, it's for other subjects, we're able to say, right, you can have a look at your groups and you can see who the students who are kind of categorized in terms of issues. And so you can see straight away from a teacher's point of view, you can see what you can do to support those kinds of students. And we're kind of on the first initial wave of this at the moment. So what we're doing primarily is looking at the decoding students at the moment. So in a class list, teachers know this and they can know that. Now this information is a lot more useful than actually a reading age. And so actually we've got something specific to tell teachers of what they can do. And if they're struggling, they can see this. And we've given some ideas of what they can do. So just going back a bit, this is what we've sort of suggested to teachers. If you've got students decoding, now, all the strategies that we're saying along the way, you could use for any level. This isn't just about students who are struggling to decode, but these will help. These are the things you can do as a teacher. So certainly those students, but obviously it will help those who are deeper readers and those who are, fluent readers, and help those in inference. It's still part of that package of reading. So, talking about morphology, breaking words down, etymology, teaching tier 2 words, and even looking at the phonics of things. Okay, so that's just how we kind of developed with our journey as we went along. So then we kind of looked at this. So we had the reading test and thinking, right, well, we've got a standardized reading test. Okay, let's have a look at how we're assessing reading at the moment. And so a lot of the time we were assessing reading through essays. Okay, and it wasn't just GCSE style kind of things. We were looking at essays and we were working from that. So a lot of the time, and that's quite a lot of cognitive overload for a teacher, because you're not just assessing understanding of knowledge, you're also assessing actually inferring what they can and can't do. And there's so much behind that. So we were noticing a lot of problems with the existing reading assessments that we were doing. So one of the things we were spotting is that the way that things happened, essays tended to mark boys' abilities. And we were seeing at GCSE, we were seeing some really, really good results for some boys. Yet all the way through their time in school, we'd been quite harsh and quite negative, but that was because the default method for judging them in terms of reading ability was an essay. So 2 or 3 pages and of what they can do. So we're finding that quite a problem. So we kind of thought, what can we do to change that system? We then realized that a lot of what our essays were doing was focused on knowledge recall rather than actual reading. So it was about what the teacher had said. It was not about independent inferences that the students make. You'll notice that the top end students would make those inferences naturally, but what we were seeing was students who were fairly towards the middle and to the bottom, what they would do is just repeat what the teacher had said. So that's what you were judging. So you weren't able to see what extra value the students were adding to things. And then we were seeing another issue with essays was that separating what the teacher has said and the students' ideas. And that was quite a bit of a gap that we're seeing. So, it was often we're rewarding what the teacher had said and not what the student had said, or it was based on the knowledge rather than anything else. So you can see that we're seeing quite a lot of problems with our existing assessment system. And as I've said to you before, it's really, really difficult from an essay to judge what students can do. It's more of an end product, not really something you can significantly pick out the different issues and problems. And if we're honest, what did teachers do? They relied on markers. They relied on specific phrases, particular words or sentence construction, which indicated that a student was reaching high levels. So, if they were talking about symbolism, they were doing much better than a student who wasn't talking about symbolism. And so teachers would look for the shortcuts and go, right, well, that is it. Okay. And often the feedback on essays were always about the writing. It was how could we write this better rather than how can we read better? And there was quite a bit of a problem there. So all the way through, and how we used to do our assessments was basically an essay. Okay, so they've done Shakespeare, we're now going to write an essay. So it was very, very problematic for us. And I'm generally of the thinking that essays, therefore, are poor proxies for gauging reading. Okay, yes, there is a massive reading component, but we've also got the writing element that kind of fits into that. So we looked at essays and we're going, right, well, this isn't working for us and it's not helping the students. It's not helping us to address the problems and the issues. So then we moved on to looking at multiple choice questions. Now, English and dealing with literacy, it is full of issues, okay? And so I think everything we do, we should really interrogate and think what are the problems, what are the issues. Now, I think multiple choice quizzes as well as essays, they do have their value. My problem is that when you put them at paramount position, then everything changes around them. We were focusing on writing essays and not focusing on reading and developing reading. So looking at the multiple choice quizzes, and I have shared these before with what I have done. So we started practicing and trialing with multiple choice quizzes, and they have some benefit. They are good in some ways. They're quick and easy to mark. However, the problems that we found with them is that they oversimplified the reading. Okay, talk to any English teacher and they'll, we never agree on one particular thing or one particular reading. And so when you're using multiple choice quizzes, you're trying to simplify a very complex process into 4 possible answers. And it really just oversimplifies. And there's never enough boxes to tick to actually approach any text itself. So it became too simplified in a way. We couldn't be sure either whether it was a lucky guess or not. We use multiple choice quizzes still now for knowledge, but there are some students who will guess. And so it becomes problematic from that angle. How do we know that the student has understood this or got this right, or it wasn't a lucky guess? Okay, and there is that element if we're realistic. It turned reading into a right and wrong. It didn't teach reading into a varying shades of different things. Okay, it was either right or wrong. And that kind of stuck with us as English teachers, is that, that it's either right or wrong. For us, it didn't work. So that was one of the reasons. And as I said to you before, it failed to address multiple meanings and interpretations. And what we were noticing is that you couldn't tell what was going on in the reading process. Multiple choice quizzes were great for seeing knowledge and seeing if they've got stuff, but it didn't really unpick what was really going on under the surface with the reading itself. And we found it very, very hard to see any patterns of data in terms of what students can and can't do with their reading. So that's where we were. Okay, so we got to that point, we were looking at these things, what could we do? And so we started looking at the research. And so the Education Endowment Foundation, okay, throwing out loads of stuff out there and some really, really interesting stuff about what to do. And a lot of it was about active approaches in terms of reading, about modeling reading, engaging, showing students when to approach their knowledge and how to approach that knowledge when reading a text. And so it was talking about modeling and using those sorts of things. So we looked about what we could do. And this is another fantastic document. It's only with last few years really that we've kind of got this sort of picture. And if I'm honest, English teachers, we haven't really had that much training in reading, and there hasn't been much stuff out there. And so it's been great to see this kind of understanding of what actually makes reading. And so we kind of picked out stuff. And one of the things that we kind of picked up on was inference. And for us, we were spotting that inference was possibly the big threshold point for a lot of our students. Now, our demographic of students is we get a few students who are still under the reading age of about 9. Okay, so we get a few of those compared to other schools. So we were spotting that we've got programs to deal with those and we've got interventions, but we hadn't got anything to deal with really that middle ground and kind of pushing further. We know what to do kind of the top end, but we weren't quite clear how could we push students up. So inferences was one of the ways that we were looking at it. So I did a little bit of research and exploring what we could find out about inference and have a look at it. And if I'm honest, I was never really taught about inference in my training as an English teacher. I think a lot of it is kind of assumed that we know about inference, we know what inference is. And so as a teacher and as a practitioner, a lot of my knowledge of reading was kind of basically, it is there, okay, but I didn't have the terminology to describe it. And I think that's where we need to help teachers and we need to help schools develop that terminology to talk about reading and actually to understand what an inference is and to be talking about those sorts of things. So we looked at a little bit of research around inference and I came across this document and it's a fantastic document. It was produced by the government, Anne Kispel of 2008. If you type it into Google, it's a primary document, but I think it's possibly the most straightforward, easiest way to approach reading and to understand. Now, our primary colleagues are absolutely brilliant. I'm married to a primary school teacher, and so all the time I'm asking what's going on. And I think we haven't really got that level of knowledge and expertise, and that's why we're seeing a lot of primary school teachers come in secondary school to help us with the phonics level in particular, but we haven't really addressed the inference level. So what I'm going to talk to you, and I'm just going to give you a kind of a potted kind of understanding of inference. Now, inference, we can term it as a number of different things. We can term it as an opinion, as an idea. Some people use the phrase reading between the lines, okay, subtext. There's a number of different terms that we're talking about here. Now, what I'm going to do is just going to give you a kind of a bit of a potted history, potted explanation of an inference, okay? So there are a number of different types of inference. Now, what we tend to know as inference is elaborative inference. So if we're reading something or we're looking at a character or something in a story and we see that they're sad, we kind of make an inference about what is the reason that made them sad. Or for example, if it's in a room and a vase has been knocked over, okay, we probably can infer that a pet did it, or if the window's open, we think the wind's done it. So that's the most that we kind of understand in terms of inference. But there are a number of different types of inference, and this is where it's really important for reading, for us to understand how students formulate these inferences. So there is something called coherence inference, and this is what a lot of secondary schools really need to kind of think about, because that is joining the dots up in a text. So for example, if in a story, the first sentence refers to Tom, and then in the rest of the paragraph or story, every reference to Tom is using he. So students have got to make that inference, that connection between those two, that he means Tom. Now, in a story, that's fairly straightforward because you've generally only got a few characters. However, when you're doing geography, or you're dealing with history, or you're dealing with any subject where there's a number of different subjects, then the confusion comes in. And you'll see that with some of the weakest readers, because what they're not able to do is get to the end of a paragraph and realize who the subject it's talking about. And so that is something that we really need to work on. Now, global inferences and local inferences. Now, if we have a look, most of our weaker students, they make local inferences. So what they'll do is they'll look at one particular thing and they'll build an inference around it. Now, the best students, what they'll do is they'll look at the whole text. And so they'll look at a combination of a local, one little line or word, and they'll use evidence from somewhere else in the text. So what we need our students to be doing is make a combination of those two, but the far weaker students tend to focus on local inferences. And then the next set is online and offline inferences. So an online inference is what most adults do. As you're reading a text, you are making small little opinions, small little ideas as you go along, and we're doing that automatically. Okay, and then at the end, we might have a think and we make an opinion based on an offline inference based on our memory. Okay, so what we notice with a lot of students, our students in particular, is that they don't make lots of online inferences. What they do is they try to make lots of offline inferences. So they read the text, they look at the question, and then they try to make those inferences. And actually, where the problem is because they haven't engaged with the reading during the process, when they've got to the end, they've got to do all that thought process at the end rather than in the middle of it. So that should just give you a bit of a potted kind of understanding of how inference works, okay? And we may talk about this with students and explain this with students. And then there's other inferences in there. So there may be knowledge-based inferences. So that's an inference where you really need a specific inference knowledge outside the text to help you form that opinion. And then another one is a evaluative inference. So it might be which character is more adventurous. And so you'd have to weigh up using different characters and thinking about that. But that just generally gives you a bit of a kind of a potted idea of inference. It is a short, quick thing, but I would say, look at Kispel's work. It's a nice little report. It's quite easy written as well. So it's quite quick and easy to follow and photocopy. So, and from that, we then had a look at how we can improve reading and get things better. So then we looked at the rest of it, and this is what came out, and it's quite interesting stuff that came out in terms of inference. Now, some of it is common sense, but obviously some of it is what we can do as practitioners within the classroom and within schools. So you can see that students need to have a competent working memory. So we're thinking about the cognitive process. They need to be active readers. Okay, so what they need to be doing is making those inferences all the time and build a mental model in their heads, which is what we notice some students don't do. All right, so they need to be an active reader. If we look at our readers, they're often quite passive. Okay, they sit there, they don't engage. That's where things like reciprocal reading helps. But also monitoring comprehension and repairing inconsistencies. And I think that for us was the key thing. And that's where our kind of the developing brilliant readers comes in, is that we've kind of written the tests to kind of help us understand the elements of comprehension and where are there inconsistencies, where are they not making things. And then other things, which is what we're kind of knowing ourselves about, is about vocabulary and the importance of wide background knowledge. Another interesting thing that she picked up on was about this idea of cultural background, is that there's a lot of assumptions in texts and the text themselves. Do students know about this cultural background that's needed? So for example, if it's talking about a seaside, do students understand the cultural background associated with it? So there's quite a lot in there, but it wasn't just that report itself. But Kispel came out with some quite interesting things for us as readers. Okay, so it kind of picked out this, that students are far easier with narrative writing than expository writing, so that's non-fiction. So you can see, and we know that ourselves, It's not quite obvious, but it is something that students struggle with. They are taught from primary school onwards to make inferences about character, about relationships, but they're not taught with non-fiction to make those inferences. Non-fiction is seen as information, and they're not seen as something that you have to dig deep to find stuff in it. And that's going to come up as a bit of a pattern later on. The other things that we picked up is that obviously we know this, that where they're an expert, they're better at making inferences. So we have to kind of push them where they're not an expert. This is an interesting one. The more synonyms in a text, the greater level of inferences. So that means that often, and we see this in secondary schools, that secondary schools use a number of different synonyms, the same word with different meaning, same meaning, but different word. So for example, instead of Queen Elizabeth I, they may use monarch. And so what we'd notice is that actually students have to make that cohesive inference through a piece of non-fiction in a history lesson. And if a student doesn't know that a monarch is Queen and Queen Elizabeth I, they're all the same thing, that student isn't going to understand the rest of that text. You can see how really that cohesion element is a really, really important thing. And then moving on. Okay, and often what we notice in text is kind of the first sentence tends to be the more really important one for inferences, and the rest of the sentences in a paragraph linked to that. So we're coming up with quite a lot of interesting things from that there. And it's said that questions within the text help support inferences. Now, the way that we've structured our test is so that students read a bit and then they have some questions to kind of help support them. Because what we noticed with that online and offline inferences is kind of doing things to support that development of reading and not just being passive itself. And then, as I've mentioned before, reciprocal reading was seen as a very, very good way of doing this. Now, I'm going to skip through some other kind of theory and some other approaches that will kind of give some insight to what we've kind of been talking about. So Curry and Kane, so their kind of research came up with some interesting things. So obviously about age, so the age of students affects their memory, okay? I think that is fairly common sense. However, the younger the student is, the ability to retain information with two successive sentences. And that's quite an interesting thing. Do students remember things from one sentence to another? And that's another thing that I think we've got to look at as practitioners. And thinking about what we said about inferences in non-fiction texts, are they making the connection between it and government in the first sentence? And it seems quite obvious when we think about it, but actually it's not for students. And if you haven't picked up that skill and that level of understanding and that ability to actually follow the thread, then these students are going to struggle and they are going to have those problems. And this is where, linking back to the Education Endowment Foundation, that what we have to do is kind of model that reading process, show them how to do it. So another thing is, and this is what they said, Curry and Kane said, richer vocabulary helps them to retain information. So all the work we're doing on vocabulary will help them increase their verbal memory. Now, this was an interesting thing, and linking to Kane and Oakhill is this idea that students don't always know when to draw on background knowledge during text comprehension. And as I said to you about that offline and online element, is that often they do it afterwards and they don't do it during that. And that's that active reading process. What we need students to be doing as they're reading it is calling upon that background knowledge and not doing it afterwards, which is what we're spotting and what we're seeing. Now, further things, okay, is quite interesting about how vocabulary knowledge was critical in developing global inferences. And I think this is where we've got some work in helping students with their vocabulary to form inferences that they can use about a whole text. And I think there's certain scope in terms of that there. As mentioned before, the pronoun synonyms helping with that coherence element, okay, and about the speed of retrieval, okay. So this idea of the idea of local coherence, and this idea of kind of the speed of things at which kind of things they do things. Now, moving on, and this is kind of the most recent research that we've got in terms of reading. Now, this kind of research was based on, it was looking at online reading and how students read online. And it came up with quite a few interesting things. Is that, and I think this sums up secondary school students to a T, okay, is that children prioritize efficiency over completedness. Okay, so what they're trying to do is they're trying to complete things rather than doing the job properly. And so they're making it seem, and they're racing to fill it in, but what they're not actually doing is concerned about making sure that it is right. And I think that, for me, single-handedly, okay, is the problem. And as they've got here, is that the generating of inferences only comes when it's necessary. So when we force students to make those inferences. So it's a really, really kind of thing. And I think that in secondary schools, that is the problem. You know, they only make inferences when they're forced to make inferences, or they have to make inferences, and they're more bothered about finishing rather than the depth and the quality. And that's the big difference. And I think that's one of the things that we certainly kind of worked on and we noticed with our students itself. So I'm just going to speed on a little bit because I'm conscious of time, so we can go on to the next bit. Okay, so a lot of what the research is showing us is obviously we need to look at the processes involved. And because reading is an internalized process, is that we're only looking at writing and we're looking at what students produce. And so we really do have to interrogate what students produce in terms of their work so that we understand the reading process. Because I think what's happening is we're making assumptions based on our own reading. And if we're clear, you know, we have some biases about our own reading skills. And so I would say that lots of us see students and look at them and think they read the way that we read. And they see things the way that we see things. And they approach text the way that we do this. And so we don't actually explicitly model because we think they've got that process already, that they understand those processes, they understand the benefits of it. So I thought that this really, from Dan James Murphy, Thinking of Reading, they're doing some pioneering stuff with reading at the moment, but look, this really summed up that students need to be actively taught to think about what they are reading, particularly at secondary school, where they're expected to read in order to learn. There should be opportunities for students to make links between the different parts of the text, their own knowledge and experience, and the author's purposes. So what they're kind of saying is that the process needs to be more of an active process, and we need to be kind of interrogating it, not assuming. And I think reading, if we're honest, in an English classroom, it tends to be we let them read an extract on their own, or the teacher reads it, but often we don't interrogate the actual reading process. And we stress annotating, but we don't actually support and process and help with the processes that are linked behind it. So what we decided to do with the reading test, and this was before Collins got involved, because they kind of sort of saw this and said, right, we'd like to take this further. So we decided that we were going to do a reading test, and we were going to look at the reading test, and we were going to change that reading test away from where it had always been. So we had a look at different tests, and we had a look at the Key Stage 2 SATs papers, and we've had a look and thought, how can we do that? And it just didn't work for us. It didn't work. And we found a lot of things tended to be focusing on language techniques. So it would be like, spot this, why is the writer used this particular word? And it tended to be more about GCSE work than it actually did about understanding what students can do. So we kind of compiled a very quick sort of test where we picked out a number of different skills. So what we wanted to be able to do is see that they could find bits of information, that where they had some word knowledge, and we could just track see what they understood. And there were two parts of that word understanding. There was understanding the meaning of a word, but also the second part is, what does a word mean in a particular context? So often students could give a definition, but they didn't apply the word in the context. And that was quite an important thing for us that we wanted to see. And as you can see, that our test was a lot about inference, and we made it about inference and really put that at the heart of what we're doing, because we wanted them to be better at making those inferences. But also we wanted to acknowledge that, yes, we want them to be able to talk about techniques. And so what we've got is some ideas there so they can show us those techniques. We weren't thinking about explaining those techniques and doing that sort of GCSE explanation stuff. That can come later on in Key Stage 4. And what we're trying to do is build up so that they could form an opinion right at the end. And they had some techniques and they could do that. So instead of being a very kind of jigsaw kind of assessment, we wanted something that was quite sort of straightforward, that we could see where are the issues and how we can address it. So that was kind of what we created. And then we were then going to look at how students interacted the text. And so this is an example. So this is a real example from students in my class, okay, in this classroom here. So these are 3 students, and you can see 3 different interactions with the text. And so what we're using, the reading test, is instead of creating a generalized report of going, these are the issues, we're actually engaging and having a look. So rather than just throwing away the scripts and the annotations, we had a look. And if we had a look, and we've shown this to students, is that I think you can guess which student did really well, the student in the middle, okay? And what was quite interesting about the student in the middle is he was listening to advice and he was making those inferences as he went along. And so he was looking at words and building it. Now, teaching GCSE is really interesting, looking at how students engage with the GCSE papers. And I always recommend heads of department to do this, to have a look at students, see what they're doing. And what we're spotting is that they weren't making those natural inferences. Okay, students would highlight every single technique, but they wouldn't read the extract. So here is that perfect opportunity. Here is somebody making sure that they understand the text and understand what's going on inside the text. So it's a really good indicator of that. So we can see what we're doing. If you have a look at the other 2, you can see, well, this one just underlined random bits. This bit did nothing. And you can kind of see the grading that happened with it. So moving on, okay? So we built on that idea of what can we do to support inference and how can we build it? Because we just refer to it as reading between the lines, but actually there's a bit more to reading between the lines, because students have to understand what the process of making inference is. And that's a starting point. They need to know that there is something underneath the surface, and a character says this, but they mean this. And that's a really hard concept to understand if you're struggling with reading. And so we kind of looked at how we can support students with this process. So they've got to be able to then distinguish between what's explicit and what's implicit. And that certainly becomes a problem for non-fiction, because students really struggle with that on non-fiction. In fiction, they can generally find the implicit stuff because they're used to people saying one thing but meaning another thing. And so there are lots of things that we have to help students with that inference process. So helping with the vocabulary that they need, how to use that knowledge, how to use that experience in there. Now, I'm very clear that we have to address in an English curriculum, and I think within schools, inference. Okay, whatever subject you're in, students will have to be making inferences. Yes, they'll have to find information, but they will have to infer stuff as well. And so we kind of did a little bit more research. We found that thinking reading, James and Dan Murphy as well, they came up with another type of inference. So there's logical implications. And so you can see we've got probable inference, and then we've got possible inferences. Now, the reason why I'm kind of talking about quite a bit about inference is because I think it is something that we really need to work on with students. And that's the kind of the creation of the test itself to help us build this up. So if we have a look at inference itself, so if we look at fiction, action, dialogue, physical aspects, most students know that if a character does something, this means something about what they're thinking or feeling. That's general. We do that from beginning of primary school. Okay. However, when we look at GCSE papers and we look at sort of the English GCSE paper, and this is just English in particular, you've got so many inferences that you've got to make. You've got to infer what is being said about a topic for question 2, but you've got to infer what the writer means. You've got to infer what the writer thinks and feels, the perspective, and then you've got to infer why they think that particular way. And adding to that, when you're writing, you've got to make inferences. And so you can see that there's quite a lot in there when we're coming to English. When we look at non-fiction in particular, if we look at non-fiction, and this is where the thing is hard for non-fiction, and particularly when we're looking at other subjects, is a non-fiction text has explicit thoughts and feelings, perspective, but also it has implicit thoughts and feelings and perspective. And so when you see students looking at a piece of non-fiction, they often find information that is on the explicit, and they're not understanding that actually there is a subtext behind non-fiction. All texts have that subtext, those layers of meaning. And so that is where we have a problem in particular. So one of the things that I've been doing is talking around with different schools, is looking at how we can develop those inferences. So for example, here are 3 sentences from a book, piece of autobiography, Toast by Nigel Slater. And there are inferences that we can make from this. So for example, we can get the inference that he's not surprised that his mother's burnt a toast. He can make the inference that mother always burns toast, or my mother is a terrible cook. So you can make inferences from that. So he says one thing, but he means something else. And actually, if we have a look at that extract in a bit more detail, he actually loves his mum. And you can see that in there, but it's not explicit. And so where we have the problem with non-fiction is students seeing this implicit knowledge in non-fiction. And that, particularly across secondary schools, is the problem. They're not seeing these 2 layers of information. They are looking for find and locate. And so in geography and history, we need them to make those inferences. We need them to make those inferences if they're going to get better. That's how we're going to unlock those higher marks for them. And at the moment, non-fiction is just viewed on an explicit level. So we just looked at how we can develop this for students. So for example, we can actually teach students to include inferences. They do it with creative writing, but they don't do it with non-fiction. So I think there is ways that we can do this. Now, linking into literature as well. Literature is all about inferences. We make inferences about a character, so which is an opinion. We make inferences about the reader. We make inferences about the writer. So you can see everywhere within the English curriculum and other subjects is this inference. And yes, focus on words is important, but we need to get students making those inferences and looking at how they can do that. So to kind of finish off now, I'm just going to kind of go through some examples. So this is from the test, and I'm going to kind of show you how we approach the test itself. Now, we've included the mark scheme, and what we've got is a number of questions. So we broke the paper, and so they read a bit and they answer some questions. They read another bit, they answer some questions, and then they think about the whole thing. Now, that global thinking, so we're able to build up to that global inference element. So what we're going to do is just going to have a look at some examples from some students. So this was done a couple of weeks ago for one of my own classes, and we're just going to have a look at some of the inferences and kind of unpick, because I'm going to be honest, this is what we need to do as practitioners: understand the basics and understand what's going on in a student's head. So this is the question that we gave. Now, you don't need the full text for this, okay? Basically, what we've got in the book, the extract, is a boy called William. He's a very, very naughty boy. It's Christmas Day, and he's bought some presents previously for his family, and he's bought presents that he wants for himself. And so he's got some bad, some presents that his family won't like, and he's ready to give them to him. So this is the morning of Christmas Day, and it just says the line, "The maids were not down yet." Okay, so we asked students to, after they've read a little bit of the extract, said, well, what can we infer from this? And it comes up with some quite interesting things. So if you have a look at the top one here, so in this one, the student says, you can infer that they have taken the presents from the boy, okay? And then they've crossed that out, and William's house, and they've made it escape, or that they do not like Christmas. Now, here's quite interesting. Now, this is that speculative kind of inference. Now, this is where it gets hard for English teachers, because we're like, well, that is an inference. They have inferred. However, it's not really appropriate. And I think it's kind of unrealistic when you look at the text. But what it does show is it shows that that student is kind of speculating. They're not actually thinking about the whole text, because it doesn't mention anything about the maids at any other point. It just has this one line. So it shows that the student has kind of just guessed in terms of that situation, and they've kind of speculated. And the interesting thing is that usually writers, what they will do is, if somebody is bad, they're going to signal it beforehand, but there's no clue in the text. So they're just jumping the gun in there. So you can see it's quite interesting, but look at that he's gone through that process. So he's gone through one speculative, inference, followed by another. Okay. Then we've got the next one, that they, the family, are rich, and that they have a big house, so they need maids. So that's generally the kind of inference we were looking for. So you can see that really, there is that background knowledge. They need to understand that maids are associated with money, and also that they're there for big houses, so people can cope. So you can see that there's that background knowledge, and you can see that that student in the first one isn't using that knowledge that second one is. So it shows us an opportunity to go, look, let's not speculate, let's look at evidence within the text. So here are some others. Again, slight, appropriate. So we've got that it was early in the morning, okay, and that the maids were not awakened down. So we could say that's an inference. That's kind of making sense in the text, isn't it? But also the maids are not ready yet. Well, that's kind of sort of often kind of repeating. And what we noticed is that students tend to repeat or reword, to not actually generate their own inference. And if we go back to this one, rich and big, those are inference words that they've kind of generated. If we have a look at this, these two tend to just repeat what's down there. And here we've just got this almost rewording it, not down yet, not ready yet. So they've kind of reworded it. So what we were spotting is quite a few students were rewording, and that was how they thought you could generate an inference. So reword it in your own way, and that somehow deals with it. And here's some more then. So that they had to wait for the maids, or they normally come really late. Really, again, kind of repeating, wasn't really looking at the rest of the text. So you can see that some students were just kind of like spotting things, or just looking at a local inference and not thinking about the whole thing. And so you can see between these that there are a different quality behind the inference that they could make. And obviously we've got another one at the bottom there, that they're a very wealthy family and they afford to have maids and live there. So you can see that we've got somebody who's expanding and they're developing. You can see that this one is a lot better than the other one in terms of their explanation. So they go in that a little bit further. So one little process, one little question, and we can really unpick what's going on behind this inference and what's going on. Now, the students may never ever have to have this kind of context, and that is the thing about reading tests, is they may never get another extract like this. However, what we've got to do is help them to actually use that background knowledge, explore what's in the text, and go through that reading process. So what we would then do is kind of look at the problems around a question. So the problem that we were noticing with this one is that we've got supposition and speculative. So they were kind of really kind of throwing ideas out there, but they may be that there was a level of sense behind it, but they weren't logical within the text itself. And it really gets you to think under the surface of a text and what's really going on. It was the lack of rewording. So we had students rewording the phrase to try and make an inference. But then we also had this lack of precision. So students weren't really precise, they weren't really clear. And then we were also noticing that there was a lack of global thinking. It only mentioned maids in this one little bit here. It didn't mention it anywhere else. So clearly the fact that the maids weren't down yet isn't a massive deal in terms of the storytelling. So that's what we would do. So we'd look at the test and we'd explore it. And so we can understand what the students have got to do for the next stage. So what would we do then? So we would probably clarify what maids are associated with as somebody being rich. So make sure they've got that background knowledge and they understand, we'd probably explore that in a bit more detail and understand what MAIDs are, just so when they get it later on. Now, as it happens, GCSE, they're going to do inspector calls, so they need to know about MAIDs. And so really, we can inform with our curriculum, we can support them there. But also, we need to clarify what inference means, and it being quite specific and say, it's not a guess, but it is actually something that we can make sense in this text here. But also, it's not rewording, okay? And there is that point. But also, making a distinction between supposition and inference, okay? It's fine to suppose, that's a good skill to have, but actually, have you got enough evidence? You know, the fact that that student put down that they'd stolen presents is supposition. It's got no other evidence to prove that. It's kind of spurious, really, if we think about it. Okay, and reminding the value of pausing before responding. So that's the sort of things that we might do. I'm not going to do this now because I'm conscious of time, but the next thing we would do is have a look at another sentence and think about what we could infer. And so we did this last week. We looked at this one and thought, what could we infer about this? And obviously it's excitement, that he's pleased that it's Christmas, he's pleased to give his presents to his parents. We were able to take that quite a bit further, so we were able to model and show them how to do it. And then what we're going to do is then we look at our next steps in terms of the teaching. So we're then working for the next term or so as we're preparing them. And this is something that we're going to support our lessons. So it is about annotating for inferences. So we're not spotting techniques, we're making inferences as we go along, and about slowing the reading and looking at local and global inferences to support information. So what we're actually doing is using the test to inform our teaching and to look at how we teach. We're going to still keep the content the same, but what we're going to do, instead of looking at Macbeth and talking about the techniques, we're going to put the angle on inference and annotating extracts for inference, rather than finding the first kind of technique they can find and trying to understand that. What is the character thinking? What are they feeling? How do I know that? And then moving on, the next thing is that we will test them. We test students with this paper. We do it twice a year. Okay, I don't think there's any benefit of doing tests all the time. What we need students to get better. There needs to be gaps between the time, and hopefully within teaching and in your exercise books, we're going to see that develop. We're going to see that improvement. So what we use the tests for is very, very simply, we rank order the students to give us an idea of where students are, to give us almost like a GCSE rank order, so we can see in terms of their level of ability. And then we're able to see and go, right, student X, I would expect them in the top 10%. So why are they not there? And there we can unpick the problems. We tend to use an average score on the test. And so we're working at the average and say, right, well, this is what an average would be at GCSE. So average, you are in line with everybody else. And that's what we're looking to do, to see that students are in line with each other and working through those. Now, we do it with different year groups, so we can see what the impact is and what the issues are, because each different year group has a different identity in terms of reading. And then we'll track by comparing papers, and then we'll track within lessons. And so, for example, that student with the speculative fiction, you know, the inferences, I will be looking now in lessons, talking to him and actually asking questions about inferences. And when he's doing that speculative thinking, I'll go, right, well, hang on there, have we got evidence? How can you prove that? Because that seems to be the issue that student's having. He's making lots of speculations and lots of ideas, but are they relevant? Are they good? Can we refine them and make them better? So what we're able to do from this is to be able to generate 3 different kinds of issues. So we can see what are the student issues on an individual level. So we're able to do that. So this is the issue with this student. They're making speculative, or they're focused on the local inferences. They're not making global inferences. But then we're also, because we do it all at the same time, we're able to identify year group issues. So that means if it's a year group issue, we can then look at our curriculum and then say, right, we've noticed this. Our students are not reading the text, and they are looking at the question and they are not doing that. So we need to address that. We need to focus on that. And then it highlights school issues. What is the issue? You know, like we spotted there about maids, is that a school issue? Do students understand what a maid is or how there is, who would have them? Okay, is that an issue? And so it allows us to have a three-pronged attack and a three-level of understanding. So as a curriculum leader myself, I've got the overview of what the issue is for the school, the year group, and the classroom teachers can then tell us about the student issues. And it means that we're having that intelligent discussion with reading and about reading and helping students to get better. And I would say for me, the most interesting thing is that it is that interrogation. It's that interrogation of thinking, what students are doing and how students come up to ideas and doing that thinking about it. I think the beauty that other subjects have is they're able to kind of unpick quite a lot of misconceptions and issues that happen in their subject. And in English, we really struggle because English is such a fuzzy kind of beautiful thing, but it is kind of fuzzy. And I think for us, we've been able to kind of solidify and being able to kind of have a look and really, really channel in and focus on particular problems and particular issues so that we can help our students get better. And that is about it. I apologize, I've gone a little bit over, 5 minutes over. That's my enthusiasm to kind of talk about so much, but I hope that's been useful. We're going to have some questions now, I believe. But I will say that if anybody wants to contact me, they can do. There's my Twitter handle. I'm more than happy to talk and discuss things, but I'll stop now to let Kathy ask some questions.
Thank you so much, Chris. That's been an incredibly rich and enlightening presentation. And I'm sure people have got lots of questions. We've got a couple coming through in the chat now, so I'll just ask you a couple of those. So we have one from Catherine, and she said, this style of reading test looks really valuable. Do you, or how do you, generate grades for students based on these kind of assessments?
Right, okay, well, I kind of alluded to it. So we've moved away from a graded system. So at Key Stage 3, we have 4 different grades, and you've kind of seen that there, which is emerging, developing, good, and strong, okay? Which, no matter whatever school you have, they're going to have some system, aren't they? So what we tend to do, if we had to put it on a graded level, if we were using GCSE grades, and I'd always be cautious because, you know, this is the thing, we're dealing with students and we're not dealing with like for like stuff. We tend to sort of say, if you think about average at GCSE is a grade 4, and that's what we would tend to do if we were going to do that. But we are not comparing like for like. Okay, but what we have done, particularly we do it for writing, particularly with no more marking, is that we can generate a rank order. Once you've got a rank order, you kind of know based on your cohort how many students roughly are in a particular kind of level of grade, and so we kind of map over that way. But we've moved away from that as a school, you see, so we don't apply GCSE grades, but that's how we would do it, is kind of map it across the way there. Yep.
Thank you, that's wonderful. And then we've got another question from Tony, so asking, how much input do pupils have before doing the test for the first time? So are you using it as a baseline, or do you prepare them beforehand?
Okay, we don't prepare them initially, because at the end of the day, what you want to do is see how students react to things. And I think the problem that we have sometimes is if we prepare them too much, we don't see what the problems are, and we're kind of like we're masking what the issues are. So often with year 7s, we use as a baseline reading assessment. We'll just do it and just say, right, you've got it. Usually year 7s are fairly good because they've been trained with the SAT, but what you often see sometimes is they don't annotate the text. And I think that for me is, I want to see what they do with the text and how they react to the text. And I think that's really, really important. Yes, we can go in and create a false artifice of how they're going to deal with the text, but really, I want to know what they're like, because in about several years' time, they're going to do a GCSE exam. I want to see what is the pattern that they've got for something they've never seen before and how they approach it.
Fantastic, thank you. And we've got one from Lauren. Lauren's asking, do you use non-fiction tests in the same way?
Yeah, very much. And in the product itself, we've kind of included some non-fiction. We've done more fiction because that's generally how most people's curriculums work, but we have got some non-fiction in there. I think certainly there needs to be more work generally across the whole curriculums in terms of non-fiction, but there are some in there as well. We do.
Great, thank you. And I think we've got a few more questions if people are happy to stay on for a couple
I'm
of minutes.
happy.
So we've got one question from David, who asks, to what extent do you think having students make summaries of a text can help with making inferences?
Yeah, I think well, it is part of the inference skill. I think having the vocabulary to be able to make those, that's the problem that we have with summaries sometimes, is students haven't got the kind of the vocabulary to make an effective summary. And what we tend to get is repetition rather than those inferences. I think there's nothing wrong, and I certainly do it at Key Stage 4 when looking at the GCSE exam papers, is they will make summaries alongside the text. I think the danger is that if they're not making minor inferences during the sentences as they're going along. And I think if we oversimplify the process, that they just put something down the margin, it can oversimplify that process. Now, it's fine at some level, but I think, what we want is students to really, really kind of think, oh, this room is quite dark. I wonder why this room is quite dark. It's that active process, really.
Fantastic, thank you. And then perhaps a final question from Tina, who's asking, if you were to grade, where would you place students that are a grade 4? Would they be developing or secure?
We tend to, as a school, we go with good. So we say, so generally I wasn't expecting to kind of talk about my school system, but yeah, what we tend to look at is, for us, is the main judgment for us in terms of assessment is average. So we look at that. So that is the starting point, because if you have a look at how data is formed at GCSE, the starting point is usually the national average, which forms the grade 4. And so for us, the good, where the good is meeting, where at the bottom of the good is the average. And so that's where we want students to be, okay? So the developing is they're nearly there, nearly in line, okay? And what we'll see is proportionally our data matches nationally in terms of how many students are strong at the top end. So they're the kind of the grade 9s, 8s and 7s, okay? And towards the bottom, the emerging tends to be grade 1 to 2 and so on.
Fantastic. And then maybe just a final one from Lucy, who's asked, can the test be used to track reading progress over Key Stage 3? Yeah,
I mean, it's quite a hard thing, because you're not tracking like for like. And that is the really, really important thing that you've got to be thinking about. If you do the same test, okay, and you let students forget about it, which is often what happens with the pre-bought tests themselves, then you're able to, but you are looking at text with a different context. And so if you think about the GCSE papers themselves, the grade boundaries change depending on how hard or difficult the papers are. So we're not talking like for like each year GCSE wise. And so some years the papers will be generous in terms of the grade boundaries. Sometimes they'll be harsh because lots of people have done really, really well. So it's quite hard to develop a kind of a testing system that kind of works where you can kind of compare like for like, because you are looking at different things. We've got a number of different texts in the pack itself. We have got pre-1914 texts, we've got modern text. So you're not necessarily looking at the same sorts of things. And so that's the problem that we've got when you're tracking things. What you should be able to do is you should be able to see the rank order of the students and see how they're improving. Okay, we use these tests alongside a standardized, reading age test. Okay, we've got that. Most schools standard have got that, and so we use that. So we use that kind of at the end of each year, and this is kind of like another thing that kind of to support that. But where we have the problem with the reading age test itself is it doesn't allow us to interrogate the data, doesn't allow us to look at those things. They often give you, little lovely, well-presented reports, but they don't help you. They don't tell you what Tom's got to do to get better. They don't tell us what the problems that Tom's got with his reading. And so you should be able to see between one test to another improvement.
Thank you, that's brilliant.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Chris, for that absolutely fascinating webinar. Just to say, we will send around the recording in the next week and we'll be in touch with the lucky prize draw winner. I hope you've all enjoyed the session as much as I have and hope you have wonderful evenings. Thank you.
Thank you. And
thank you. Goodbye.